Hey, what's up guys? capnbozzy here. This is Mass Effect 3 Multiplayer N7 Academy Part 13. And in this episode, we'll be covering the Human Engineer. So let's take a look at her powers. So a lot of people, I'm sure, use the combat drone. I personally am not going to use this in this particular build. However, if you wanted to, something that you could certainly change in this build would be the rank 6 in this alliance training here. Right now, I have this to decrease all weight of all weapons by 20%. You can do that, of course, or weapon damage bonus here. I'll go into that once I go through the other ones first. But just to let you know, if you wanted to use the combat drone, that's definitely not a bad idea. I personally just don't use it because whenever I've tried to use it before, personally, I just haven't found it to be all that useful, at least not as useful as using the power combos presented by Incinerate and Overload. So, just right off the bat, I just want to mention that in case that's something that you usually do. So this build's going to be just a little bit different, more power oriented. Okay, so moving on to Incinerate here. Of course, we have impact radius versus damage for this ranked 4. I go with damage simply because most of the time with Incinerate, you're only going to be targeting enemies who are either close or mid-range. You're not really going to be using this on enemies who are really far across the map. So to me, damage is much more important with that. With rank 5, this is of course just doing some more damage with the burning damage. With recharge speed, that's not really too necessary. I'm going to be compensating for recharge speed in other ways. And lastly here with armor damage, so this is just damage to armor targets versus freeze combo. I'm really not going to be doing I'm not going to be using cryo ammo, so this is not something where doing cryo explosions is going to come in handy. That's really would only be if I was playing with playing on a team where someone was probably using something like snap freeze. So that's usually not going to be the case, and I'm going to be detonating my own fire explosions pretty much the entire time. Either fire explosions or tech bursts, mainly fire explosions. So really what you want to be doing with Incinerate is, of course, setting up those fire explosions and also using it to really take down armor very quickly. Okay, so moving on to Overload here. With Overload, as I've discussed before when I talked about this in the Turian Ghost Infiltrator video, I personally don't usually use Chain Overload. I usually just go with pure damage because I'm going to be just focusing on one enemy at a time when I'm using Overload, and that's to strip their shields and also to detonate fire explosions that I'm going to prime with Incinerate. Obviously, if you are playing with a team who was going to be able to prime explosions for you, then it may be it's not a bad idea to go Chain Overload. Just if you are probably going to be doing most of your own priming and detonating, then I was just going with damage. And of course for rank 5 here, Overload's a pretty fast cooldown power, so I definitely suggest going with Neural Shock, which just incapacitates organic enemies for a short duration. So basically a husk is running at you and you use Overload on them with Neural Shock and it will just knock them down, and I use that over recharge speed. And lastly here, rather than doing more Chain Overload, I go with shield damage to do more increased damage to shields and barriers. Okay, and then moving on to Alliance Training. So once again, this is going to be a very power combo based build. So really I want to do as much as I can to make sure my cooldown speeds are fast and also that I have a lot of power damage and force bonuses. So that's what I'm doing here over weapon damage, and the same thing here. I'm going to go with more increased power damage and force bonuses rather than headshot damage. And lastly, this is certainly arguable. If you want to put more damage into your weapons, you could certainly do that, but this is just to give me some more cooldown speed with decreased weight on my weapons. And lastly, with fitness, I just have it with extra health and shield bonuses all the way through. Okay. So moving on here to weapons. I personally use the Cerberus, the Harrier, and the Acolyte with this kit. Previously, when I used to play with this kit, I used to use the an SMG. I used to use the Hurricane and the Acolyte with her, but frankly, I personally moved to the Harrier just so that I would be doing more damage, and I would also be covering more range with her overall. So you could really go either way with you know, an assault rifle and a pistol, or an SMG and a pistol, you know, whatever you have unlocked. So something like, you know, a Harrier or a particle rifle, or, you know, something like, see, a Medic or an Avenger. If you're just starting out, those are the ones that I recommend. And also, if you have a Lancer unlocked, that's also a pretty good choice. Okay, so and then like usual, I recommend the Acolyte, which is really used for stripping shields, and if you run out of ammo in your Harrier. So for the weapon mods I always suggest going with the magazine upgrade for the Harrier, because it has pretty low ammo, and I also go with the extended barrel to give it increased damage. And for the Acolyte, I suggest going with the high caliber barrel for increased damage. And this one, you could certainly could be interchangeable. You can go with power damage. You could also go with something like ultralight pistol materials, or if you want to go with something like a pistol piercing mod or melee stunner if you do a lot of meleeing. Any of those will really work just fine. And then for equipment here, you could certainly go with any type of tech-based ammo power. You could go with you know, cryo, disruptor, or incendiary rounds. I personally usually don't use incendiary because I like to save them for other kits that don't have any type of, you know, fire-based power. Because, you know, since she has incinerate, she can do her priming for fire explosions using that. Thus, I like to use either disruptor rounds or cryo rounds. Usually, disruptor rounds are what I prefer more. And then, of course, if you have, depending on what weapons you're using, if you're using an assault rifle and a pistol, then either a pistol amp or an assault rifle amp will work. Or, of course, if you're using an SMG instead, an SMG rail amp. Or if you don't have any of those, any of these you know, mods available, then you could also go with something like targeting VI to help with headshot damage. Definitely suggest here going with a cyclonic modulator just to give you some more shield strength. Although alternatively, you could also go with something like adrenaline mods to give you some faster speed, power efficiency if you want some better power recharge bonus, power amp for better power damage, and stabilization module if you are using a Hurricane and don't have the stabilizer for that, which you can put directly on the gun. And then lastly here, I personally use omnicapacitors to help with tech damage and give you some more power recharge speed for your cooldowns. Alternatively, you could also use combatives upgrade to give you some more pistol and assault rifle damage. You could also use something like, of course, just like an assault rifle amp or a pistol amp. And of course, also, if you don't have something like cyclonic modulator, you could also use shield booster to give yourself that shield boost there. Okay, so that really wraps up the build. It's pretty straightforward. So let's get into the game, and I'll show you how to play with her. Well, him or her, depending on if you're using the male or the female.
A tactically significant area has been located. We have multiple hostiles in this zone. Get in there and take them out. Acknowledged.
Okay, so for my keybinds here, of course, if I was using a combat drone, that would be with middle mouse or 3, but I'm not going to use that, so I just have incinerate and overload. Incinerate, of course, I'm using with X and then F for overload. So My main power combo here is going to be using Incinerate to prime for fire explosions, and then Overload to detonate the fire explosion. So I'll show you that in just a second here. Let's get us a Marauder. Alright, there's a Marauder right there. Alright. There you go, there's your fire explosion. And it's really that simple. That's all your goal is playing with an engineer is really just to be setting up these fire explosions. And of course, if you're playing with other tech players on your team, well, of course, this will work with biotics as well. Setting them up for fire explosions. Really, you just want to be playing kind of a utility role where you're really just doing a lot of priming. And of course, depending on who's your team, you could also be the main detonator as well with Overload. But most of the time, you're going to be just being the primary primer on your team. Basically just incinerating everything you can constantly. So just over and over and over again, just hitting everything you can with Incinerate, and that will be really useful to your team because you just want as many things as possible being primed and detonated. So just like most human kits, she has a pretty basic melee of just using the Omni Blade. And it's important to note, this is really a build that, since you don't have the combat drone, that's leaving you a lot more vulnerable. So in a solo like this, if I was going to solo with this kit, I would probably use the combat drone. But really, this is a build that is meant to be played on a team, so that, like I said, you're really acting as the main, primer on your team for setting up those fire explosions. And just like the other human players, human kits, she has a standard role where she just, nothing really too fancy. So with most engineers in the game, really their role is to be a support class. Like I said, they're really all about their powers with priming and detonating tech combos. And there's just certain classes in the game that are like that. Obviously, you know, classes like soldiers are meant to be a lot more. You know, they're meant to be like the heavy hitters. They're going to be doing a lot more weapon damage, and they're going to be oriented to you know, get a lot more kills. Whereas engineers tend to be a lot squishier. So I think a lot of players they may think that there aren't really defined like roles or classes in this game, because and I admit it is a little bit murky how the way, you know, different classes operate, because, you know, obviously you can get a lot of kills with any you know, class or kit really. You know, and it's not like there's nothing really specific that any of the classes can do that any of the other ones can't. It's just that they're designed with their powers and their you know, their level of health and shields, their speed, etc. To do particular things better than other types of kits and classes. So where the engineer obviously specializes is in doing you know, things with tech. So in other words, you know, priming and detonating. So priming and detonating, and if of course you're using you know, like a combat drone, then you know, using the drone or the turret or whatever you have with your particular kit to use it as a distraction. So that's what I mean by them being basically engineers being a support class, is they're really meant to just, you know, serve one specific function, like being a main primary, primer or detonator, or if you're using a drone or a turret, to be you know, more of like a distraction against the enemies, rather than necessarily being a main heavy hitter who's going to be getting a lot of kills. Or so of course used by themselves, engineers are you know, kind of squishy and not all that powerful when it comes to getting kills. But on a team, they can be extremely important if used right in assisting the other players on the team, you know, to get a lot of kills by setting up the tech combos. So just keep that in mind, because later on, once I get into discussing team builds, and I'll do a specific video just showcasing different team builds, the, you know, classes like engineers will absolutely be crucial in you know, being the kits that help to synergize the team build, so that you have lots of you know, power comboing going on. So just like other kits that I've demonstrated already, you just want to be using the Acolyte to strip shields. Their shields are already stripped. Then using Incinerate to prime, and then as you can see there, using Overload to detonate the fire explosion. And there you go. Okay, I think I covered everything. If I missed anything, I'll let you know in the comments. And so that's going to wrap it up, and I'll see you next time, where we're going to cover the Solarian Infiltrator. So thanks a lot for watching, and capnbozzy out.